The singer, whose latest album is called Love, is getting a lot of hate right now. This after federal authorities have raided two properties linked to him, one on each coast. Sean Combs appears to be part of an investigation into a sex trafficking operation. And of course, this comes as he faces multiple lawsuits that accuse him of assault and abuse, and he denies it all. We're bringing you the latest details to drop in connection with Diddy and the massive investigation. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. So we have been focusing very heavily on the Sean Diddy Combs story. I mean, what's interesting about this is we actually were focusing on it, 3-4 weeks ago? I did a very big sidebar on it where I broke down all of the latest lawsuits facing the rapper, the mogul, the reported billionaire. And at the time, we were really highlighting one of the big lawsuits that he was facing. A producer named Little Rod Jones had sued him for sexual harassment, sexual assault, was alleging absolutely horrendous things against him. And this is on the heels of other lawsuits. Remember, Cassie Ventura had filed a lawsuit against him. She settled the day after, but she accused him of rape and human trafficking. I mean, the worst stuff you can imagine. And then all of a sudden you fast forward, and this week you see Diddy's name throughout the whole news. Why? Because federal agents raided properties that were connected to the rapper this past Monday. And it was reported that this is all in connection to an ongoing sex trafficking investigation. Now, to be clear, it has not been 100% confirmed by authorities if Combs is a target or subject of the investigation. Certain outlets are reporting that Combs is the target. What do I mean by that? Target is essentially the person that prosecutors have evidence against. They're the one they're building a criminal case against. So if he's the target of the investigation, that is a very big deal. It is being reported that the search was pursuant to a search warrant issued through the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Need probable cause that a crime has been committed, gathering evidence in connection of that. And clearly, a federal judge signed off on this in order for these properties to be raided. And who were they raided by? Homeland Security carried out the raid. Homeland Security focuses on human trafficking investigations, among other things. Now, NBC News reported that several people have been interviewed by federal authorities in connection to allegations of sex trafficking, sexual assault, solicitation, distribution of illegal narcotics and firearms. This is so eerily reminiscent and consistent with the allegations from all of these high-profile lawsuits that I mentioned that were filed against Combs, his family, his businesses, his associates, sex trafficking, sexual harassment, sexual assault. It was a wild scene, though, at these properties. You saw agents swarming onto the properties, sometimes with guns drawn. We saw video of several individuals, including who appear to be Combs' sons, Justin and King, in handcuffs. Now, it seems like they were detained, not arrested. And at the time of this recording, it is not clear where Sean Combs is. There's been mixed reporting about his jet, his location. We don't really know. But what we do know is that at the time of this recording, neither he nor anyone else has been arrested or charged or indicted in connection with this operation. There are some updates, though, and those updates are what we want to talk about. So first up, there was this idea, as I mentioned, this probable cause, the search warrant signed by a judge. That's a very big deal. And we still don't know what exactly they're looking for. When you talk about sex trafficking, human trafficking, you're talking about bringing people across state lines for sexual activities, for commercial profit. Commercial sex acts is another way to say it. And so what they might be looking at, you might be looking at documents, you might be looking at computers, electronic devices. One of the things that stands out to me when I think about one of these prior lawsuits, Little Rod Jones, this producer, he alleged that Sean Combs has cameras in all of his homes, and these cameras captured a lot of this illicit behavior as a form of blackmail. So was it possible they were looking at the camera systems? We just don't know. But one of the big updates that I have to talk about is this statement from Combs' attorney, Aaron Dyer. This statement reads, and it was from yesterday, it says, quote, "Yesterday, there was a gross overuse of military-level force as search warrants were executed at Mr. Combs' residences. There is no excuse for the excessive show of force and hostility exhibited by authorities or the way his children and employees were treated. Mr. Combs was never detained, but spoke to and cooperated with authorities. Despite media speculation, neither Mr. Combs nor any of his family members have been arrested, nor has their ability to travel been restricted in any way. This unprecedented ambush, paired with an advanced, coordinated media presence, leads to a premature rush to judgment of Mr. Combs and is nothing more than a witch hunt based on meritless accusations made in civil lawsuits. There has been no finding of criminal or civil liability with any of these allegations. Mr. Combs is innocent and will continue to fight every single day to clear his name. A lot of things to break down from this one. Number one, yes, he hasn't currently been charged with anything. The civil cases, one settled, the other ones are still ongoing, so he has not been found liable. That is all true. That could change. Is it premature to call this a witch hunt? Possibly. One of the things that I've noted is that you could say it's unique that indictments, arrests have not come in conjunction with a massive raid like this. Sometimes, usually they do, but other times they don't. You need to build a case. And you hear this idea about perhaps that federal authorities have spoken with a number of individuals that might have given them probable cause to then go for the search warrant to find more information. We've interviewed Tracy Walder, former FBI CIA agent, who said that you go into these properties, this raid, one of the things you needed to do was to actually retain evidence, make sure it's not destroyed. Perhaps authorities were tipped off that evidence was about to be destroyed. Not clear. But the idea of this military level force I thought was so interesting because we have to remember, again, going back to the lawsuits, again, these are lawsuits, these are allegations, different standard. We're not talking about a criminal case. But when we talk about that and we look at the allegations in these lawsuits, there has been allegations of firearms possession, that Diddy forced his associates to carry weapons for him. There was a shooting that was referenced, two shootings. Let me rephrase, two shootings were referenced in that Little Rod Jones lawsuit where Diddy engaged in this or allegedly engaged in this and then had people cover up for him. So with those thoughts in mind, and you're looking at how big these properties are, it is not surprising that you see this level of force. Authorities don't know what they're going into, and they have to detain people, bring them outside, not only for their safety, but for the safety of the people they detained as well as they're going into these properties. So the level of military force, you could argue, was justified. They mentioned that these electronics were seized. We don't know what the contents of them are. We don't know exactly what they're looking for, but that digital footprint, as we've covered in a number of cases, can be quite substantial. And ABC has reported that agents seized a number of electronic devices. Now, there's another update we want to talk about. I mentioned how there's been no arrests or indictments. Yes, in connection with the sex trafficking investigation. However, there was an arrest of a man named Brendan Paul, someone who is alleged to be Combs' drug mule, alleged that he supplied him with these illicit substances. This is, I believe, an allegation in the Little Rod Jones lawsuit. Well, he was arrested for cocaine and marijuana possession out in Florida, I believe at the airport. He has been bailed out. Just a little interesting detail about that. Now, his attorney, Brian Bieber, issued a statement to CNN. The statement says, quote, "We do not plan on trying this case in the media. All issues will be dealt with in court." Interesting. Also want to talk about the arrests here. So, again, there's been no arrests, but there could have been false speculation. There could have been rumors that Diddy's sons, Justin and King, were arrested. They were handcuffed outside of the LA property during the raid. No indication they were arrested. TMZ actually reported that they came back to the home to move things out. When we first saw the images of this, I was reminded that his son, one of his sons, was implicated in wrongdoing in a lot of these illicit acts by Little Rod Jones in that lawsuit. That one of his sons was involved in a shooting at a music studio, that his son was present during a party where minor underage women were present. So when I first saw the images of them in handcuffs, you could make the mental leap that they were possibly arrested, but that is not the case. They were just detained. Now, I also want to highlight something that was a little disturbing. So when this happened, this raid happened, apparently some guy shows up outside of the raid in LA, claims to be Diddy's neighbor, tells reporters that he was noticing some shady things going down with Diddy, said he saw some wild things at night. It was reported on, it was amplified, it was circulated around. Turns out that may not even be true, that he may not even be a neighbor, that I have to highlight this when we're talking about a high profile person like Diddy, okay? Rumors, speculation, misinformation is going to happen. And we have to be careful of that. We have to be mindful of that. And in a legal point of view, when you talk about Diddy and his cases, one of the things he has said in the past about all of these lawsuits is that it's a chain reaction. One person comes out, another person comes out, another person comes out. It's a money grab. They're making things up. That could very well be true, but it could also be that they're telling the truth. So we have to always keep a mindful eye about people's motivations and why they're going to be coming out during this time. Let's always remember that. And talking about that, let's talk about the celebrity reaction. So there are some celebrities who have made comments about this raid, including Cassie Ventura, whose lawsuit really blew open the whole thing for the public. She accused Combs, as I said, for years of abuse, assault, rape, trafficking. The events she described in her lawsuit were horrific. And one day after she filed it, Combs settled. Those details were confidential. But Douglas Wigdor, who represents Ms. Ventura, as well as a Jane Doe that filed claims against Combs, said in a statement, quote, "We will always support law enforcement when it seeks to prosecute those that have violated the law. Hopefully, this is the beginning of a process that will hold Mr. Combs responsible for his depraved conduct." Even when you settle a case, those individuals could still cooperate with law enforcement. And I got the impression that after the Ventura settlement, it was never absolving Combs of wrongdoing. So let's be clear of that. There are others who have had beef with Sean Combs in the past. He has a long-standing public feud with fellow rapper 50 Cent, who after the raid posted on Instagram, "Now it's not Diddy Do It, it's Diddy Done." That seems to be in reference to a documentary series that he's trying to put forward, the Diddy Do It. But he goes, "It's Diddy Done. They don't come like that unless they got a case." Since then, he's posted several memes mocking Diddy's legal troubles. He also said Diddy was, quote, "too freaky for society." And then we have Aubrey O'Day. She also commented on the raids. Now, Combs helped launch her music career in the early 2000s on his reality show Making the Band 3. She joined a group that became known as Danity Kane. But in later seasons of the show, O'Day was dismissed from the group, with Combs saying, quote, "She wasn't the same person he signed. That fame had changed her." But in a podcast in 2022, O'Day revealed that she was fired because, quote, "she wasn't willing to do what was expected of her, not talent-wise, but in other areas." Well, after the raids on Combs' home, O'Day posted, quote, "What you sow, you shall reap. I pray this emboldens all of us victims to finally speak on what we have endured." That is quite the statement. All right, so those are some developments. We will continue to follow what happens in the Sean Diddy Combs case. Stay with us here on Sidebar. We'll always have a lot more for you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jesse Weber. Until next time.
Hello there, everybody, and welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. You know what time it is, right? This is the time, once again, we are taking your viewer questions on the developing investigation into music mogul Sean Diddy Combs. That's right. Submit your questions on Facebook, Twitter, X, YouTube. Your super chats are actually the best way to get your questions right at the top. We'll answer them here on air. Got a great panel I'm going to mention in a minute, but first, let me break it down for you. So this is where the case we're talking about the rappers' multi-million-dollar properties in LA and Miami. They were searched by Homeland Security earlier this week. This was purportedly in connection to an ongoing New York sex trafficking investigation. An officer from the Department of Homeland Security released a statement saying, quote, "We believe there is a disturbing history of sex trafficking." Also said that this is a specific search. Now, the raids came amid several lawsuits, civil lawsuits that were filed in the past several months, accusing the rapper of sexual assault, including rape, domestic violence. The 54-year-old was not detained. He's cooperated with authorities. That's according to his lawyer. He has not been criminally charged. Let's make that very clear. But there are these allegations that are out there. And his whereabouts, they were unknown to the public until earlier today when he was seen at a Topgolf with his twin teen daughters. That is such a tongue twister. I'm not going to say it like that again. But this was down in Miami. And the latest, we also have a jailhouse call that has surfaced online between Combs and Suge Knight, where he's heard telling Combs, quote, "I'll tell you what, Puffy, your life is in danger because you know the secrets. Who's involved in that little secret room you guys are participating in? They gonna get you if they can." Now, again, Combs has not been criminally charged in connection with the allegations. And as the story develops, we're going to bring you the very latest. In the meantime, as we take your questions, let me bring in my A team. I'm joined right now by two great guests, Law&Crime's legal analyst Imran Ansari, right here in studio with me, and former FBI and CIA agent Tracy Walder out of Dallas, Texas, who I have been picking her brain since the beginning of the week to get some answers to this. And now we have a flood of questions. Let's get right into it. First from Twitter, X. It's from @Are you Peter or are you Patricia? That's a question only you can answer. The question is, with Diddy now being on law enforcement's radar and Keefe D facing trial for the murder of Tupac, do you believe Diddy's alleged involvement in this murder could also be investigated in the future? I will start with you, Imran, on that. Let me give you a little perspective on this. I interviewed someone last night who said that this is not connected to that. In other words, they didn't have any reason to believe that Keefe D was cooperating with law enforcement in connection with this investigation. But that's not quite the viewer's question. It was a little bit more connected to, could this also be investigated in the future? What do you think?
No, I think absolutely. If there's going to be an investigation into Sean P. Diddy Combs here, that, anything is on the table if there's going to be evidence that's discovered. This is all speculation right now, Jesse, of course. But if we see that during the course of this investigation, if there is any relevant information or evidence that is connected to that, then I am sure law enforcement are going to be looking at it, and prosecutors would be looking at it. Whether there's any cooperation going on that would be linking the individual to what's going on now with the raids and the investigation following those civil lawsuits, I don't think there's any hard connection right now. But of course, it remains to be seen as this investigation goes forward.
Okay, Tracy, over to you. We have another question. This one's from YouTube. A big question that people are wondering is what is happening right now? So this is from T. Lawton Hound. How come there are no updates where this fool is at? Nothing online. Well, again, we know he's in Miami, but is it that surprising we don't have any updates on the status of the investigation?
That's a good question. I think yes and no. I think they were very pointed in terms of why they were raiding his houses, and they are looking at a sex trafficking investigation. That's going to take some time to put together. And again, I've said this before, I think this was all about the preservation of evidence. And so I think his whereabouts, and I think we speculated on this before, I don't think he's going anywhere either. I think he's going to stay where he is. And I think they're less concerned about him fleeing per se. And I don't think that they're necessarily going to be giving us kind of detailed updates that I know people want, because this is a pending investigation. And they are trying to build a case to bring additional charges and ultimately an indictment. And so they're not going to do anything to really compromise that in any way, shape, or form.
Over to you, Imran. Jan from YouTube, why are they arresting everyone else but him? I don't know what that means exactly. If they're referring to Brendan Paul, who is the alleged drug mule. The reason I say alleged is because it's connected to that lawsuit that was filed against P. Diddy by his former producer, Rodney Jones, said that this man right here is the one who supplies drugs and firearms to Diddy. He was picked up at the airport. He was charged with 2 felony counts in Florida of drug possession, marijuana, cocaine. But why are they arresting everyone else but him? So I don't know if I haven't heard of any other arrests, but I guess the question is, why did they arrest him?
Yeah, I mean, that is the only arrest that has happened to date with someone who is associated with Combs. And of course, you need probable cause to make an arrest. And I think what we see now with the raids of Combs' residences, both residences, they're going to see if they have the evidence. And if they're able to build a case, if there is probable cause, If there is an indictment that is coming down the line, then there will be arrests. But again, it is premature. We are speculating at this point, but we can read the tea leaves. This is serious. This doesn't happen every day. They wouldn't be making that raid on those residents if there wasn't a rationale or reason behind it. But there's no arrest yet because we don't know what information they have, what evidence they have, whether they have probable cause, or whether there's an indictment looming.
Let's talk about the arrest for a second. I'll follow this up. This is from Katie Marie on YouTube. What is the level of proof needed to arrest someone, to secure an arrest?
So, well, probable cause, right? And here there needs to be a sufficient amount of evidence to give probable cause that Combs was involved in any sort of crime. But again, Jesse, these sort of actions, in terms of raids like this, and if you look at the timeline of events, of the accusations that went out in those civil lawsuits, the sex trafficking allegations that then followed, and also the government statements about the raids, you can expect that there's going to be some action, whether it be against Combs or some of his associates, remains to be seen. But I think that we will be waiting and seeing if those arrests will be made.
All right, I'm going over to Tracy now. Talking about arrests, let's get very, very specific here, because this is from Ave J. Lee on YouTube. Will he get cuffed? That's the question. In other words, let's expand that a little bit. If he is arrested, what will it look like?
That is actually an excellent question because, and again, we've talked before, this is an individual who has had issues with weapons in the past and has had some issues with violence, quite frankly, in the past, going all the way back past his dating with Jennifer Lopez. And so I personally feel that an arrest like that, if he is arrested, again, innocent until proven guilty, I do think there will be some teams and force utilized, just like what we saw with them making entry into his homes, simply because of the past history that he has. That's pretty normal. Although they may give him the opportunity to turn himself in. I think that would be an interesting update if something like that happened. However, I do suspect if he's not given the opportunity to turn himself in, he will be arrested very, very early in the morning, right when they can come in and knock and announce, and they will be there with special teams.
Let me just follow up that with a question of my own. Any chance, based on what his attorney said, there's been no restrictions placed on his travel. Any chance he picks up and leaves?
In my opinion, I do think he could potentially pick up and leave. But I guess the way that I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about that from, the FBI and CIA perspective of overseas. I don't know what country would grant him a visa entry, depending on the kind of country that he was going to. And so I think that is up in the air as well. I don't think he's going to necessarily pick up and leave. I personally think he's probably going to stay where he is. I think he feels pretty confident, quite frankly, about where he is. And I just don't see that.
Yeah. And if he picks up and leaves, that makes him look really bad. Two,
he screams guilty.
Yeah. Two, there could be his associates, family members who could be in legal jeopardy here. That might be a way to pressure him back. I don't know if he wants to leave them alone, but also he might not think they have anything. But I think that's a really good point. Let me go over to you, Imran, on this part. This is from Too Many Cactus from YouTube. Sounds like somebody that lives in New Mexico or Arizona. What is the difference between trafficking and being a John?
Well, trafficking would be actually involved in the trafficking of a human being. If it's sex trafficking, we're talking about sex trafficking here, across borders for the purpose of, say, prostitution.
And by that you mean like harboring somebody, soliciting somebody.
Correct.
Actually transporting somebody.
Yeah. When you're a John, you're essentially the customer, right? So if someone is sex trafficking an individual to another, that another would be the potential John. So the best way to put it in simple terms, Jesse, is that a sex trafficker is actually complicit in, let's say, quote unquote, pimping someone out or transporting them for the purposes of prostitution, et cetera, whereas a John is the customer.
And to be also clear, it's usually through the use of fraud, coercion. When we talk about commercial sex acts, it's not necessarily just paying them for sex acts. It could be promising them payment, promising them something of value, fraudulently promising them something of value, which, by the way, is a component in the Little Rod Jones lawsuit, because the idea is he claimed he wasn't paid what he was owed and was subject to a lot of disturbing behavior, behavior, and he was the subject of sexual assault at the hands of Diddy, hands of Cuba Gooding Jr. That's one of the allegations as well. Let me just follow up with you because this is connected to the sex trafficking component. And again, Diddy has not been charged with anything at this point. There are questions of could he be charged federally under the sex trafficking statute. Ashley Reyes, what is the minimum type for this type of charge? Meaning prison.
Okay. Well, it could vary, right? You'd have to go on a federal sentencing guidelines. But sex trafficking, Jesse, depending how many counts he would, or I shouldn't say an individual would be charged with, it would all depend on the amount of counts, what the circumstances are, and the sentencing guidelines, which would follow whether a person has a criminal past and the basic federal minimums for a charge. So there's so many variables that would go into that, Jesse. It's hard to say, but sex trafficking is a serious felony crime, and it's not something that would give itself or lend itself to a lenient sentence.
No. Look at R. Kelly. I think that's a clear example. We actually interviewed the R. Kelly prosecutor. We have an episode coming out on Sidebar, kind of made the comparisons between this case and R. Kelly, even though we know Combs hasn't been charged yet. Okay, going to you, Tracy. This is from the Voodoo You Do. What a great name. Voodoo You Do on YouTube. What is the difference between pending investigation or ongoing investigation? Is there a difference?
In my opinion, no. We use those kind of two words interchangeably, if you will. You know, a pending investigation really is the idea that you are building a case, if you will, through the collection of evidence to ultimately obtain an indictment, right? So everything is pending. An indictment might be pending, an arrest might be pending, but at the same time, in an ongoing process, you are obtaining evidence, you are obtaining forensics, you are obtaining digital records to build that investigation. And so everything is pending simply because at this point in time, we don't have that indictment and we don't have that arrest. So really, I guess the terms are used interchangeably, if you will.
Speaking about a potential indictment, Imran, I will throw this back to you. The question from Capri Law on YouTube, is it possible he will have indictments out of both California and Florida?
It is possible. I think the nexus, though, in terms of these raids, which are the residents in California and Florida, but I think the focal point here, Jesse, is going to be a case here in New York, and that would be the Southern District of New York, I would imagine, I would expect. So even though these raids are happening in these jurisdictions, if, and it's a big if there is some legal action that is taken vis-a-vis an indictment of Sean Puffy Combs, I believe it would be venued here in New York City in the Southern District of New York.
Let's go over to Matthew Robillard from YouTube. Tracy, I'm going to throw this one to you. Realistically speaking, what are the chances that all those raids happen and ended up with Diddy not being guilty on any charges, especially with all the people coming out now? Just I'll caveat that a little bit because you're assuming that there would be an arrest and it would go to trial and you'd be found not guilty. Another way of looking at it is saying, Tracy, what's the chances these raids happen and he's never charged?
I think, and if that's okay, that's kind of the way I'd like to look at it. Typically, when I was an FBI agent and you were obtaining warrants like this and you really didn't have enough information to ultimately obtain an arrest or an indictment, you could actually lose your job. I remember having to go on things like this, and if it didn't result in an arrest, they would kind of tease you and be like, "Don't even bother coming back." And so, 100% of the time, at least when I was working, it did result in an arrest of some sort. Now, who that arrest is going to be, I don't know the answer to that question per se, because we don't know at this point. But I would think it would be incredibly rare. I don't want to never say never, but it is incredibly rare to serve warrants of this nature and not have an indictment come out of it.
And I'm going to ask you $1 million question because we have another one coming up that's exactly what I've been asked a number of times. I'm going to throw it to you, Tracy. Before we do, let me just read off 2 questions that I can answer real quick. This is from ZOIZNYT. Why is he not in custody? Well, obviously, as we've been talking about, they are building a case. He has not been criminally charged with anything at this point. And I'll throw that back to you, Tracy. He doesn't present a danger to anyone at this point. There's no problem. He could. Allegedly, he presents a danger, but there wouldn't be any way for him to be arrested Well, let me rephrase that, actually. It's an interesting question now I'm thinking about it, because if they found weapons in his house, possibly illegal weapons, they'd have to tie it back to him. Do you think is there a possibility they could have arrested him while they investigate this case?
Look, I'm going to just be very open about this. I think sometimes when we look at sex trafficking cases, because it's not a weapon and because no one's murdered, we seem to think that people aren't a danger to society. But I actually feel that someone who is participating in sex trafficking is, quite frankly, a tremendous danger to society. But I don't know that law enforcement has necessarily caught up with that idea, and we don't necessarily view them as dangerous. But that is my opinion, and they can inflict just as much damage on the people that they're trafficking than really anyone else. And I personally wish that that was an impetus to hold someone, but unfortunately it's not.
Yep. And this is from Plausible Superhero on YouTube. Is there any feedback from the house raids? As far as we've seen, no. There have been indications that weapons were confiscated, electronics were confiscated, but what they found, what exactly they're looking for, not at this time. Imran, let me go to you. This is from L. Gabriel on YouTube. Is it strategic to arrest a person lower in the chain with the hopes of them turning on the higher ups?
Absolutely. I mean, that is the classic move to make an arrest on someone who is lower on the totem pole in the hierarchy, and then flip them, right? That is something which is so common, whether you be on the federal level as an FBI agent and working with the U.S. Attorney's Office, or even on the state level, say a district attorney with the local police department. You make an arrest, you hope you could flip that individual, and they're going to give you information and cooperate in order to then take down people up the chain of command. We see an arrest here with someone who is associated with Sean Puffy Combs, and then he may be talking, they may be trying to get him to cooperate. So it is a very typical maneuver to make a arrest of a lower individual to try to get to those on top.
Tracy, going over to you. This is from 1234 But Cool Whip on YouTube. Sorry, makes me laugh. What can I say? Did they seize his money? If not, they should.
It's my understanding, and again, I don't have insider information in regards to this, that they have not seized or frozen his assets. That is something they can do if they, I guess, want to try to keep him in the country. But again, I feel that they're not viewing him as a flight risk at this point in time, which is most likely why they haven't seized or frozen his assets. I think if he is ultimately indicted, obviously that will happen, but it's my understanding that they have not yet, although you all may know differently than I.
I have not seen anything to indicate that at this point. I think your rationale explanation for why we haven't seen that or why it didn't occur makes complete sense. Imran, I'll go to you. And this is an interesting question. Actually raised a lot of times when we talk about these high-profile individuals who are charged, who are maybe about to be charged, is what precipitated it. And here we're saying it was really the Cassie Ventura lawsuit that started a lot of this rolling. Former girlfriend of his, former performing artist that he worked with, and she alleged everything from rape, assault. He beat her, subjected her to vile sex acts, sex trafficking, sexual slavery. That lawsuit was settled, as I mentioned, but then you see a flurry of other lawsuits. So this is a good question that we have from Lumberjack on YouTube. How many people have to go to the law and file lawsuits on this boy before something's done with him?
Well, I think we're seeing it play out right now. You saw that lawsuit by Cassie, which was swiftly settled, right? Swiftly settled. But then you had the other ones that were filed. And really, that was the trigger point. That was the catalyst. The question
I think the viewer is asking is why? Why did it have to take lawsuits? And by the way, he's innocent until proven guilty. He still can defend himself in the lawsuits, but why does it take lawsuits and not just an investigation in and of itself?
Sure. Well, I don't know if he was on anyone's radar. I think those lawsuits, right, those complaints filed in court may have been the catalyst to get the attention of law enforcement, get the attention of the FBI or Homeland Security or a prosecutor's office to look more closely at him and get us to where we are now. Of course, the next step remains to be seen, but I think those lawsuits were really what put him on their radar.
Tracy, over to you. Randy Haney from YouTube asks, could authorities be following him now to make sure he doesn't flee?
Personally, again, this is just my hypothesis. I think they probably are. And I think also they were probably doing that even before the raids occurred. And I've said that before, which is probably why they moved when they moved. I think P. Diddy probably knows that they're following him right now. I have, no reason to believe that they're not, quite frankly, but I think it would be the prudent thing for them to be doing. Now, do I think they are following him in every way, shape, or form and have wiretaps and all of that? That I don't know. They would need to have warrants to do those. But I do think that someone is probably following him from law enforcement at this point, just to ensure that they have eyes on him.
Speaking of that, follow-up question from Athena Tucker on Facebook. Where is he and the plane? Well, it looks like he's in Miami based on the pictures that came out of him at this Topgolf. The plane, last I heard, it was in the Caribbean, but you tell me if you heard something else, Tracy.
So all I know about the plane, as you mentioned, was that the last time it was in the Caribbean, although it looks like its tail number has actually been scrubbed from FlightAware and some of those other apps that are really accurate, actually, quite frankly, in tracking flight data. That is something that you can do. So in my opinion, I think that that was purposely done. And that's why we don't know where the plane is right now. I think he on purpose made sure the tail number was no longer visible in those apps. That is something you can do. And the plane really could be anywhere at this point.
Another legal question for you, Imran. This is from Kale M. Would federal charges prevent additional people from bringing new civil cases?
Not at all. In fact, I think that if there are charges brought against P. Diddy, I think you would expect to see more civil lawsuits. And I'll tell you why, Jesse, and I'm not going to comment on the merits of anything right now. But speaking from personal experience from a high-profile client that I represented, there was criminal charges were brought. There were civil lawsuits that were sort of at the same time. And as that case gained more and more publicity, I saw the civil lawsuits just mushroom. There were people who were just making claims and claims and claims. And a lot of those claims were found to be unsubstantiated and frivolous. But I would expect you may see the same thing happen here if he is ultimately charged.
And if he's convicted, because we know the standard of proof is much higher in a criminal case than it is in a civil case. If they think that they could get him, if he's found guilty of these charges, like I said, he hasn't been charged with anything, but if he was found guilty, you could have somebody saying, well, the likelihood of me filing a lawsuit and being successful with the standard of proof is much lower.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. And let me ask you about this, because this is also from Matthew Robillard. Guilty or not guilty, charged or not charged, is it fair to say that Diddy's reputation will likely never be the same again, and there's a strong possibility that his career might be over? First, let me say, yes, that's a very strong possibility. I think it's very hard to recover from this. However, if you get a statement from the prosecutor's office, which I would think would be unlikely, that we're no longer investigating him, he's been totally exonerated, the best case scenario, I don't know if it would change it. What I'm curious about in talking about that, could he have any kind of legal action for the damage to his reputation?
Right. So you have the court of law, obviously, Jesse, and you have the court of public opinion. And sometimes the court of public opinion, being convicted in the court of public opinion, so to say, could be more damaging even in the court than the court of law when you're a public figure or a media individual or an entertainer. So if there was, let's just say these were unfounded and you had all these reports out there leading to defamation, if there was an ability for him to now come back and say, I was defamed, he could pursue defamation claims against individuals or media companies or
not law enforcement.
Not Law&Crime.
No, not law enforcement.
Okay. But not Law&Crime also, right? Because we're being very careful here. But law enforcement potentially, if there was anything that was untoward and they were acting on not a good faith basis,
right.
And acting on information that may not have been vetted and whatnot, there could be some sort of cause of action. But typically there's immunity involved in situations like that. More so, he would have a cause of action on a private cause of action for defamation, etc.
By the way, these are fantastic questions. Keep them coming in. Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, X. Now's the time. I have our brilliant legal mind. I have our brilliant investigative mind. And I'm just, in the middle of trying to fence it all off. All right, so let me go to you, Tracy, now. Great question from Scrublet on YouTube. What is the difference between Homeland Security and FBI? Good question, because it was Homeland Security that conducted these raids.
Right. So the FBI is part of the Department of Justice. HSI is part of the Department of Homeland Security. Both of them actually do investigate human trafficking and sex trafficking. However, the FBI investigates many other crimes aside from just human trafficking and sex trafficking. And they've only recently, in about 2021, combined with HSI to investigate these crimes. HSI, really their focus and their sole investigatory focus is to look at transnational criminal networks, which is what human trafficking and sex trafficking is. And so the reality is they're a bit better equipped, quite frankly, to conduct investigations like this. But I absolutely believe that the FBI is involved as well. But HSI is really that investigative arm, if you will, of the Department of Homeland Security. And that's really why they're taking the point on this.
Let me follow up that with you, Tracy. Melinda Matowski on YouTube asks, if they only have videos of illicit behavior, probably without sound and difficult to use as their primary evidence, they must have witnesses to this who will corroborate the video evidence, correct?
That's actually an excellent question. I personally feel they probably have both. I do think that some of the videos probably do have sound. I also think that they may have phones and text messages as well. So I think that, yes, they have witnesses who may be very bravely coming forward, quite frankly, to discuss what has happened to them, to corroborate those claims. But then I also do think another thing I think we don't think about is sort of that middleman in regards to sex trafficking and paying for videos and things of that nature are the apps that people use to pay for them on. And I do think that they probably have that.
Okay, let me go to you, Imran. We have a super chat right now. Super chat from Chill Murray. Thank you so much for the super chat. What are your thoughts on the RICO allegations? And will this avenue towards the Kim Porter homicide with a shooting in the amended filing?
Well, you know, a sex trafficking case, if they're building a sex trafficking case, Jesse, that would be something that would lend itself, if there is a large operation around P. Diddy, allegedly, that would lend itself to a RICO charge, right? So when I heard about these allegations coming out, and what I read in the civil lawsuits and the complaints that were filed, it sort of lent itself to the air of a RICO claim. So I think as the feds are looking at this and they're looking at whatever evidence they're able to glean from the raids, it would be possibly looking towards a RICO charge based on the underlying sex trafficking allegations that I think they're investigation. The Kim Porter aspect, I can't speak to that.
This was his ex-girlfriend,
right,
she died
who passed away
in 2018.
Right,
yeah.
But as far as I know, that would be a separate issue, Jesse, rather than what we're seeing here with these raids by HSI.
All right, let me go over to you, Tracy. We have another super chat. This is from Iron Gamers TV on YouTube. Plus, Diddy own more than those two homes. Are they going to check his other homes that are overseas?
So that's a great question. I would imagine yes, but I would think that these two homes were probably their first priority. In terms of his other residences, you have to remember American law enforcement, can't just go into those homes. That's not our jurisdiction. So I am assuming that we are working with the FBI legal attachés in those countries to try to obtain access to those homes, or even, quite frankly, asking those under other countries through our legal authorities and our warrants to raid those homes as well. But I think that's going to take a little bit of time. And I would imagine that these two were really their primary focus.
Tracy, you remember when I said I had the $1 million question for you? I got distracted. I didn't ask you the $1 million question. Here's the $1 million question. This is from Haystack Sniper on YouTube. If or when do you think we could possibly see an arrest related to the raids? How long does it take?
I get asked that question a lot.
I didn't say it was the $1 million question for no reason. I mean, this is the one we keep getting.
Look, I would think with a raid of this magnitude that an arrest would be forthcoming somewhat quickly. But again, that's just my hypothesis. Clearly, he is innocent until proven guilty, and maybe he's not the one who's going to be arrested, quite frankly. Right. However, evidence of this nature is going to take a very long time to go through. And a lot of human trafficking cases with children and with adults, going through that evidence, and people are not going to like the answer to this question, can sometimes take years. However, I suspect that they have more than just the digital evidence, which takes quite frankly, a very long time to go through.
I will throw that now to you, Imran, because here's the way that I look at it. At first, I said to myself, there's no arrest or indictment in conjunction with the raids, which we have seen before. But look, they're building a case, and they might be issuing subpoenas to people right now for more information. They have to go through all of the evidence that was gathered at those homes. And so that's going to take some time. And my understanding is, wouldn't they have to submit it to a grand jury in New York to get back an indictment? That could take time too.
No, absolutely. So, it's the evidence that gives way to the charges, right? The prosecutors are going to be looking at the evidence that the federal agents are able to get from this to see if there's enough evidence to bring an indictment, to give enough probable cause for an arrest, and then look at that evidence to see if it's going to support ultimately those charges that are presented to a grand jury to vote on an indictment. It's a process that needs to play out. And as Tracy said, it could take a long time. This isn't something that could be a clean, clear shot for an indictment.
Right.
They'd have to go parse through all that evidence. But it could take a long time. And of course, a grand jury would have to vote.
And of course, they could still be interviewing witnesses even after charges come down or even after indictment. The reason I ask that, I also get asked this question a lot too. This is from Anthony Adams on YouTube. Is there any chance Jennifer Lopez may be called to testify if it goes to trial? She was named in one of the suits. Referring, of course, to the infamous nightclub shooting where the allegation was that Diddy was really responsible for that shooting and had someone as the fall guy. He was with Jennifer Lopez that night. Walk me through if you think she would she testify? Could she be called as a witness?
Absolutely. It's fair game. If they have charges that are brought that open up and make things relevant from the past, and we see that. I've seen that on cases that I have handled where you've had witnesses come out from years ago who are called to testify in order to support charges that are brought years down the line. So absolutely, if there's relevant testimony that she may give in the case, she is fair game for being called as a witness.
Tracy, over to you. We have a super chat. Thank you so much for this wonderful super chat from Caldima. What are the chances, and we've talked about this a little bit before, what are the chances the arrest of Keefe D for the Tupac Shakur murder is related to these raids? Keefe D told the FBI that Diddy paid $1 million to have Tupac killed.
I don't think it's related to these raids. I really do think because they've come out and said that this has to do with sex trafficking. I think Imran mentioned this earlier, I think it's two separate issues. It's not to say that there won't be an investigation on that. Maybe there will be. I don't know the answer to that question, but they were very, very clear about these raids being about sex trafficking. And that's not what that is about. That's about murder, quite frankly. And so I think those are two separate issues. It's not to say that you can't charge someone twice, on two different crimes. Of course you can. But I think not in relation to this issue.
Well, let me just follow that up. If they found something during this raid, Tracy, that led them to believe he was implicated in a murder or another crime, they could use that against him, right? They could charge him.
Oh, 100%. Anything that they've acquired as a result of this raid absolutely can be used to charge him in another crime. But again, I think for focus of this investigation, it sounds like it's really about sex trafficking. But of course, if you see another crime taking place on a video or something of that nature, you can absolutely charge someone with that.
So, Tracy, I asked this of Imran before. I'll just stick with you one more time. This is from Brad O'Leary on YouTube. What does human trafficking actually mean?
It's the taking of people, so adults or children, across state lines. Really, the key there is that you are taking them across state lines against their will, by force, and typically by incapacitating them. And you are getting some kind of financial gain as a result of that. Now, human trafficking can be, like a slave labor trade. We've seen that before. It can be the sex trade, which we're talking about here. There are many different illicit reasons that someone can be trafficked across borders, but it's always against their will, and it's always for financial gain for the person doing the trafficking.
Over to you, Imran. This is again from Kale M on YouTube. I'm going to a lot of different of our viewers, but this question was too good. I couldn't not throw it to you. Would the RICO, the racketeering, only address the trafficking, or would it address all crimes committed in addition to the RICO?
Well, you could bring many sort of underlying crimes as part of a RICO action, and it could be addressing the trafficking, which seems to be at the forefront here, but it could also be addressing weapons charges, or whether there's any issues with firearms and whatnot. It could really be an umbrella, Jesse, for a number of underlying or predicate crimes that could be based on the sex trafficking allegations. Could be drugs, it could be weapons, it could be the vehicle, if you will, to bring all these charges or crimes to the forefront in a prosecution under that RICO umbrella, alleging that there's some sort of criminal enterprise here. And these are all sort of predicate crimes in the furtherance of the RICO.
Again, these questions are fantastic. We're really getting into the nuts and bolts of what is happening right now. Again, we don't have an indictment. We have these raids. We're trying to parse through the language, parse through what's happening. But throw your questions in right now on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, X. We will get them up here. We will get them analyzed and answered for you. So let's continue on. Tracy, I'll throw this to you. I was kind of a question that I threw to Imran earlier. This is from Lil Shredder. No secret in the industry, so why now after all these years? But we bet we won't see those tapes. It's a good question, again, about why is this happening right now? Why were investigators maybe not doing something earlier? Again, have to emphasize this. He has not been criminally charged, okay? But there are these raids happening in 2024. How come we didn't see these raids happen at another time?
I'm just going to be blunt about it, quite frankly. I think a lot of times people are sometimes scared to do the right thing. And I think in the entertainment industry, in the industry that he was in particular, I think a lot of people felt very threatened by him. From what it sounds like, he's been involved again, and we know this, in some violent acts. And I do think some folks may have felt intimidated and didn't come forward. And as Imran mentioned before, I really think a lot of these civil suits really were the impetus for this and why it's now on individuals' radar screens. But again, he has not been indicted of any crime, and there may not have been allegations, in the past. But I do think part of why this was never really brought up before is I do think people probably felt intimidated given the nature of who we're dealing with.
Okay, going to throw to you, Imran, a couple legal questions for you. This is from Neon Jerry on YouTube. How do you pay someone for services against their will? That seems contradicting. We're talking about the sex trafficking allegations.
Yeah, well, let me break that question down.
Yeah.
So I think the aspect of being against one's will would be the transporting or movement of that individual against their will by another individual. And then the payment would be from someone who I guess is taking part, let's say in the sex trade, right? An individual is trafficked across borders or state lines against their will, and then they are, quote unquote, pimped out to a John, to use the words from the prior question. And that individual would be paying the individual who is trafficking the person against their will, not necessarily the person who is being trafficked, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And then we have another follow-up question from Dallas Buzz on YouTube. If you were at the parties where these trafficked women were at, are they liable for the crime as well? It's an interesting question because I remember in the Little Rod Jones lawsuit, there was talk about this party that happened, I think, this past summer. The allegation was that not only was Sean Diddy Combs there, but his son was there. And there were underage women and that there were sex workers. So would someone be liable if they were around Diddy at that time while this was going on? Or do they need knowledge?
I was going to say, there would have to be some sort of aspect of knowledge and participation in that in order to bring, let's say a civil charge or a civil claim against that individual. There'd have to be knowledge, or they should have known, and there would have to be some participation in it to give rise of damages. Now, in the criminal sense, again, same thing. You'd have to have knowledge. You'd have to have participation. You have to have that sort of actus reus and the mens rea, so the intent to be participating in that. But I think if you had willful ignorance of it, or you were trying to be willfully ignorant of it, but you knew it was going on and you were interjecting yourself in these parties and perhaps participating, then you would have exposure both criminally and civilly.
All right, let's keep the questions going. Keep them coming in. Ave Jolly on YouTube, if this goes to court, will it be televised? I can answer that one. It is a federal case, so the answer is no, it will not be televised. Although, any exceptions ever, Imran?
Not for a federal case.
Not for a federal case. Okay, there we go. Let's keep moving forward. This is for you, Tracy, on Facebook from Chris Buono. Some talk has been heard about secret tunnels under P. Diddy's mansion that lead to other mansions in the neighborhood, including the Playboy Mansion. Have those passageways been checked? Would they have been checked, and why?
Well, that's an interesting question. And first, I do apologize if I was unclear about the sex trafficking. Thank you, Imran, for clarifying that. The person who is being trafficked is not being paid. It is the individual who's doing the trafficking that's being paid. So thank you. In terms of tunnels, I don't know of any in particular. There are and were tunnels under the Playboy Mansion. Those tunnels were actually used mostly to transport food and things of that nature into the mansion, so it wasn't unsightly. I am sure that they have investigated his property. It's massive from top to bottom. And if there are tunnels, they saw those tunnels. But again, I would have absolutely no knowledge as to whether or not he personally had tunnels. I would be purely speculating.
So Ralph Major from YouTube asks, isn't trafficking a federal charge? My understanding it is. There is a federal statute. Is there any state statutes on trafficking?
No, typically trafficking, Jesse, would be a federal charge because you are essentially transporting an individual across state lines. That's the inherent aspect of sex trafficking. If you put it just simply in one site, one state, one location, you have essentially someone who is being either prostituted out against their will, but it doesn't have the trafficking aspect. Trafficking really involves the transportation of a human being across state lines.
Yep. Okay. I'm just going to stick with you for 1 second. This is John C. from YouTube. If it is a RICO prosecution, racketeering, could employees / former employees such as drivers, security, cleaners, accountants, etc., also be charged if they had any slight knowledge but stayed silent?
So that's a complicated question, right? Because you'd have to prove that they had the knowledge, which may be an uphill battle for a prosecutor. But let's talk about the quote unquote chain of command. Typically, RICO and racketeering cases were brought against the mafia, against organized crime. But now we see it being brought against in a variety of situations, whether it be Donald Trump and the individuals associated with him, or YSL, and that case. But if they are able to show and make this into a criminal enterprise, and that there were individuals, including those who were helping P. Diddy, drivers, et cetera, and they were complicit in this sort of scheme, then they could also be charged.
Tracy, back over to you. These are a little bit of repeat questions, but we have people just tuning in, or this is it's important to emphasize these points. Klababaum, is he on the run? All answers would say no, because he's currently in Miami. But I'll go to D-Law. Diddy is not going anywhere. They don't have enough. All hearsay?
Look, he is innocent until proven guilty. He is not arrested and he has not been indicted. So the reality is because of those circumstances, they may not have enough. I mean, my gut says that they will, but I don't think HSI shows up to your home, and I can speak to that from the FBI perspective, based on simply hearsay. In order to obtain those warrants, you have to have a mountain of evidence. I will never forget investigating bank robberies where I had fingerprints, dye packs, everything under the sun. And they still wanted me to have more evidence to obtain search warrants of homes. And so they are extremely thorough about granting those warrants. And so I don't necessarily think that this is hearsay in terms of the actual, going into his home and serving the warrant. But in terms of him ultimately being arrested, there may not be enough, although my gut says there will be.
And just to follow up with that, because I agree with you. The feds will not go in unless they feel confident. But having said that also, the idea here that was put forward by his defense attorney that this was an excessive use of force, a military grade use of force to enter into these properties and didn't arrest anybody. Do you think it was excessive or do you think it was necessary?
Yeah, that's a question I get that a lot. I feel that it was actually normal. And again, I know that frustrates some people. Again, when you're going into a situation of an individual who does have some weapons issues as well as some violence issues, in the past and they are known to have guns at the location that you are going into, and more than one of them, it is the normal thing to go in there with that use of force. It is very normal to detain anyone who is in that home. Again, they did not arrest them. They did not indict them. They simply detained them. And all of that is actually incredibly normal. I know it gives off the impression as a potential, overuse of force, but that is a very typical thing to do in a situation like this.
Going back to you, Imran, we have another super chat. This is from Gypsy Trails. Question: Robin Greenhill is named by Jones for distribution of funds illegally for sex trafficking. Greenhill is also in a 2-year suit for the same money moving activity. Why isn't this noticed? And to let you know, there was also an allegation that Diddy had paid an Instagram model as a sex worker. And when we talk about Greenhill there, she is the Love Records accountant. And it says in one of that lawsuits, upon information belief, Miss Greenhill ensured the wiring, funds transfer, or cash payments to sex workers were completed. If she is the money person, she is so heavily involved in this, either I would imagine as a potential witness or a potential defendant.
No, absolutely. Let's just take that allegation that you just read from that pleading. If that is substantiated and there was that level of complicity, and again, we need to be, no one has been charged here to this.
Yes, she's not been charged. She hasn't been charged yet.
But let's just say if there is evidence to support that allegation, I am sure law enforcement would be looking at that, not only in a civil context that you see here, but law enforcement would be looking at it in a criminal context. And that would be something we talked about, whether drivers, et cetera, would be potentially charged or would they have liability or culpability based on silence. Something like that is not just an omission, it's an act. And that would give rise certainly to criminal culpability.
Going back to you, Tracy, big question we keep getting asked is if he leaves, if he flees, if he goes to another country. This is from Paige from YouTube. What will happen if Diddy runs away to another country? Talk to us about the various options that law enforcement prosecutors could use to get him back to be criminally prosecuted.
Well, first things first, he's not under arrest, and so he is free to go. And as his attorney mentioned, there are no restrictions on his travel. So if he flees right now, under the current circumstances, he has every right to flee. I don't think that will bode well. He does have younger children, and for them, if he leaves, I think that's leaving them in a really difficult spot. Now, if a warrant is issued for his arrest, then we will engage our legal attaché offices in whatever country it is that he flees to work to have him extradited back to the United States. We do have extradition treaties with many countries, and I would suspect most countries would be, amenable to doing that and to bringing him back here. But right now, under the current circumstances, he's free to go wherever he would like.
And you said something that kind of ties into my next question. This is from Tim Z on YouTube. Why all of this, since no evidence or charges?
So I've mentioned my thoughts on that before. I think the first thing, and again, just my hypothesis, I suspect that based on the civil suits that occurred prior, that perhaps some of that may have served as evidence to obtain wiretappings, those kinds of things, on him and on his devices. And I think that they felt that evidence was perhaps going to be destroyed. And I do think that is why they made the move that they did when they did it. So I think to answer that question, why this, why now? And again, I still go back, and I've been saying this all week, it's the idea of preserving that evidence. And I think that they felt that that evidence wasn't going to be preserved for much longer.
Yep. I think that's a really good point. And by the way, just tie it back to that lawsuit that I keep mentioning from the former producer. He alleged that Diddy had cameras in every one of his homes, and those cameras captured all kinds of illicit behavior, illicit activities, and that Diddy might have been using it as a form of blackmail. So I have to imagine that the camera systems were something that could have easily recorded things. Not sure they were saved. It's an expensive process, but they could have been recorded. But they also can be easily deleted too. So there is kind of an urgency there. Not making any not making any accusations that someone was deleting evidence or trying to destroy evidence, but it is something to think about. Okay, Imran, over to you. Nani Lam Mamil so sorry. It's the best I can do on YouTube. Assuming that Diddy's parties had some part in human trafficking / minors, wouldn't the celebrities present be complicit in the crimes? Technically, they see what's happening. Okay, so now we're talking about what's knowledge here, right?
Yeah. So if they're present, and we were talking about these parties and whatever activities were going on, and they have the knowledge that someone is there against their will and that they're underage, certainly, and they don't leave, they don't report it to law enforcement, nothing like that. Certainly, there could be an argument that they have criminal exposure there because arguably they're participating in what's going on, being somewhere where there are minors who are being trafficked or used for sexual purposes. And of course, yes, it's a very dangerous proposition to be in a situation like that and have some idea that you won't have some sort of criminal exposure down the line.
So we talk about the comparisons to what's happening with Diddy, with other well-known people. I go to you, Tracy. This is Easy Hood on YouTube. What is the difference between the P. Diddy case and the Epstein case? I bet you've been asked that. Haven't you been? I bet you've been asked that at least once this week.
I think you asked me that.
I think I did ask you that. All right. I forgot I did.
But
yeah.
I could be wrong. Look, and I've said it's almost like you could make the comparison that this is the Jeffrey Epstein of, the music world. Excuse me. And so I think in a case like this, yes, if he was participating and engaging in these rings, then the reality is he most likely had a list of clients and a list of people that he was distributing to, which is what Imran was sort of talking about before. And then that would become evidence as well. And if people were involved in that, then they could potentially be brought up in charges. But again, this is all very much what if, right? Because he hasn't been charged or arrested with anything. But the reality is it is very similar to what he's doing. You talked about the digital evidence before that could be deleted, but it can also be distributed, right? And so we don't know.
And by the way, Christina Coram, who was Combs' chief of staff in one of these lawsuits, was compared as the Ghislaine Maxwell to Combs' Jeffrey Epstein. So there were these connections being made. Imran, let me turn it over to you. Music 55KKYT, do they need a new search warrant, or is the old search warrant still of value?
Well, I think you'd have to look at the search warrant itself, right? I mean, typically, and Tracy made a great point, actually, when we're looking at these raids. I mean, these are the product of search warrants, right? And in order to get a federal judge to sign off on a search warrant to this degree, to allow this much access to private residents, you're going to have to really put forth something before that federal judge to give them the knowledge that there's going to be something there and that you had the basis for that search warrant, and it passes muster. Now, do they need to get a new search warrant? It all depends on the parameters of the search warrant, but typically a search warrant will be narrowly tailored, and if they need to get a new one, they would go before the federal judge and request a new search warrant for that entity.
And I'm glad you mentioned it, because a judge had to sign off on this warrant for these raids to happen. You must be doing a great job, because we have a question from some Juju Bean on YouTube. What would be your approach if you were to represent Diddy?
Okay, well, you got to parse through whatever evidence that may be discovered here or not discovered.
Well, I mean, even before charges, what would you advise him to do right now?
Right now, stay put. We've talked about
stay silent.
Yep, stay silent and stay put. We've talked about can he go somewhere? Well, you don't want any consciousness of guilt right now, right?
Right.
You want him to stay put, stay silent, and if need be, if it comes to the point where there's an indictment or an arrest, you get knowledge of that. We're going to have a controlled surrender, and it's going to be controlled.
Tracy, 20 seconds, bling fire on YouTube. Do you think he's not fleeing because he knows he's being watched and followed, and he thinks if he attempts to leave the country, they will move and arrest him? 20 seconds.
No, and it's exactly because of what Imran said. I believe he is probably being advised not to move and to stay put because of that consciousness of guilt. So I really think that that's why he is staying where he is. I think that's what his attorney is advising him to do.
Fascinating discussion. I love having my two experts here, Tracy Walder, Imran Ansari. Really, thank you both so much for coming on, giving your perspective. Always appreciate it. And we had a really, really good discussion today. And I'll just tell you, everybody, thank you so much for submitting your questions. And we love engaging with you. We love having these conversations. As this case and other cases progress, we hope to do this a little bit more. I'm Jesse Weber. Have a great weekend, everybody. See you Monday. Thank you.